Coins clicked into metal. Pins knocked in the background. Under the humming fluorescent lights of Paradise Bowling Alley, a payphone glowed like a small island of privacy in a loud, careless room. She fed a coin, lifted the receiver, and called her mother. A simple, ordinary act that would become the last known thread of her life. Earlier that day, she had been released from police custody, sent back out into streets that offered no safety and no guarantees. She had no cell phone, no steady home, only the faint maps of places she drifted between. For a moment, under the racket of lanes and the scrape of shoes on polished wood, she sounded like any daughter calling for comfort, brief, steady, hopeful. Then the line went quiet. What followed was a silence so absolute it felt wrong. No footprints traced later, no new photos, no swipes on a card, no messages left for anyone to find. A 20-year-old vanished into the ordinary noise of a February evening and left only that thin, frightened call to hold on to. The unanswered question from that booth is what haunts this story. To understand why that single call matters, we have to meet the woman who placed it. She moved through the world as someone both young and weathered, a 20-year-old with a presence that could be easy to miss until you learned her name. Born August 4th, 1990, Ruthie Kindness carried the ordinary markers of someone trying to build a life. A high school diploma from Fife, a place on the roster as a freshman at California State University, Northridge. Those facts sit next to other, quieter details. A slight frame, roughly 5'3", brown hair and brown eyes, pierced ears, sometimes wearing acrylic nails and even highlights that flickered in sunlight. At times she answered to other names, Anna Heger, small shifts of identity that suggest both survival and secrecy. She belonged to a community, to family lines and a culture that mattered to her. And she also moved between neighborhoods and small towns where people cross paths and vanish into the noise. Those who recorded her life left traces that are clinical and stark. School records, the towns she frequented, but the image that lingers is human. A young woman with plans that reached beyond her hometown, and with the messy, complicated life that kept pulling her back. There is an odd tension in that. The record of someone who had begun to step into adulthood, set against the improvisations she had to make just to get by. Think of her as someone who carried two sets of possessions, the paperwork that declared her future, and the small private things that kept her grounded. Those private things, the way she might fix a stray lock of hair, the habit of adjusting a ring, the look she gave when a joke landed, or what turned a file into a person. They are also what make her disappearance so sharp. Not a headline, but the sudden absence of small gestures that once filled a room. Her story is not just a list of dates and places. It is a portrait of a young woman standing at the edge of things, trying to cross into something better. Next, we follow her footsteps on the day everything shifted. On the morning of February 7, 2011, Ruthie stepped out of custody in Federal Way and into a world that felt cold and unforgiving. The February air carried the damp chill of the Pacific Northwest, the kind that seeps through clothing and lingers on skin. She had no phone, no car, and nowhere certain to go. In that moment, she was 20 years old, standing on a street with only her instincts to guide her. The hours that followed were never fully mapped. What is known is that her path carried her south toward Pacific Avenue, the artery of Parkland, lined with neon signs, old storefronts, and corners where people come and go unnoticed. The rain had slicked the pavement, the sky low and gray, as she walked into the kind of stretch where routine and danger coexist in the same few blocks. Eventually, she reached Paradise Bowling Alley, a building buzzing with the thud of bowling balls and the chatter of players, where bright lights tried to mask the gloom outside. In the corner sat a payphone, already a relic even then, but for Ruthie was the only lifeline she had. She lifted the receiver and dialed her mother. The call wasn't long, but it was real, proof she was there, alive, trying to reach out. When she hung up, the world closed around her. No one can say for sure whether she stepped back into the drizzle alone or if someone was waiting nearby. No surveillance captured her leaving. No one came forward to say they'd seen her take another step. From that phone booth onward, the record of her life goes dark. And it's in that darkness where the questions begin to multiply. Because what happened in the minutes after she ended that call remains a mystery that has never been solved.
After that final phone call, Ruthie seemed to vanish into thin air. No more footsteps, no more echoes of her voice. It was as if the night swallowed her whole. She had no cell phone to track, no car to be traced, no apartment waiting with lights left on. Without those anchors, her absence was almost immediate and terrifyingly complete. Pacific Avenue was no stranger to disappearances. It was a stretch where neon lights blurred into shadows, where bars, motels, and alleys hid stories most people never told. For women alone, especially those already living on the margins, it was a place where safety was never guaranteed. Trafficking whispers followed that road for years. Stories of girls plucked from the sidewalks, their lives rewritten without consent. Ruthie stepped into that very landscape with nothing but the clothes on her back. And then, silence. What followed was not the usual chaos of someone trying to start over or run away. There were no withdrawals from a bank account, no slips under one of her known aliases, no calls to friends, no sightings anyone could confirm. She simply stopped existing in the systems that track human lives, the kind of silence that leaves families begging for even the smallest trace. And so the world kept moving. Cars rolling down Pacific Avenue, people passing in and out of the bowling alley, businesses locking up at night, while Ruthie's presence dissolved into a void. That void, still unexplained, has haunted her case ever since. It is in that void that the first shadows of possibility begin to form. Her disappearance left her family in a torment that words barely capture. Ruthie's mother, who had picked up the phone that night for what would be her daughter's last call, was suddenly living in a nightmare with no ending. Every ring of the phone after that day carried a cruel kind of hope. Maybe it was Ruthie. Maybe she was safe. But the line was always silent, or it was another stranger on the other end. That waiting became its own form of punishment. Her family did everything they could to keep her face from fading into the background. Flyers went up across Pierce County, in shop windows, bus stops, gas stations. They called, they pleaded, they spoke to anyone who would listen. Community members stepped in, offering their time, walking streets, asking questions. But the effort never grew large enough. The case never drew the spotlight it should have. For many in Parkland and beyond, Ruthie's disappearance passed by without a headline, without a story on the evening news. For her family, though, every day was a headline. Birthdays came and went without her. Holidays carried a heavy chair at the table that no one dared to fill. Each passing year stretched the distance further, and still, no answers arrived. The silence pressed down on them, a silence broken only by their own voices calling out her name in the hope that someone, somewhere, had seen something. As the years turned into more than a decade, the weight of that waiting became unbearable. It was no longer only about finding Ruthie, but about keeping her memory alive against the tide of time. And yet, despite the fading trail, her family refused to stop searching, even when it felt like the world had stopped looking with them. It is within that painful quiet that the story takes its next turn.
As the years slipped by, Ruthie's case sank into the painful category no family ever wants to hear, a cold case. Detectives could no longer follow fresh tracks, only sift through fading memories and paper trails that led nowhere. On anniversaries of her disappearance, her name resurfaced briefly in small circles, but the silence that followed each date was deafening. For her mother, those days were cruel reminders, not only of the night her daughter vanished, but of how quickly the world seemed to move on. To keep her face alive in the public eye, authorities released age-progressed images, carefully crafted renderings of what Ruthie might have looked like as she entered her 30s. The pictures carried a strange ache. They showed a life that never had the chance to unfold. They were not photographs of Ruthie growing older, but guesses at what might have been. For a mother, a sister, a cousin, these images were not comforting. They were haunting. As time passed, Ruthie's disappearance became one of many in a larger, devastating reality, the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Her name joined a list that stretched across the country, each story like hers. Women gone without explanation, families left to fight for answers on their own. What tied them all together was not only their loss, but the sense that their lives carried less weight in the eyes of the systems meant to protect them. The injustice grew heavier with every year of silence. It wasn't just about Ruthie anymore. Her absence became part of a wider wound, a symbol of how easily young Indigenous women could be erased from the streets, from the records, from the future they were supposed to have. And yet, even in the quiet, her name did not die out completely. It remained a question waiting to be answered, a voice waiting to be heard. It was in that silence, after more than a decade had passed, that the case finally took an unexpected turn.
More than a decade has passed, and the file on Ruthie has never been closed. It sits open, but untouched, collecting more dust than answers. No suspects have ever been named. No piece of evidence is surfaced to lead investigators closer to the truth. It is as if she stepped into the February air that day and was swallowed whole, leaving behind nothing but questions. For her mother, the years have been measured not in milestones, but in waiting. Each ring of the phone still carries that flicker of hope, the possibility that someone, somewhere, knows something, but the silence always follows. What keeps her going is not just the memory of her daughter's laughter or the way she dreamed bigger than the life she was born into. It's the belief that Ruthie deserves her story finished, not left in limbo. And yet, we are left staring at the heart of this mystery. How does a young woman vanish after making a phone call, in the middle of the day, in a city full of people? How can someone simply cease to exist, leaving behind no footprints, no witnesses, no trace at all? The truth is out there, buried in the shadows of Pacific Avenue, hidden in the silence of those who may have seen or heard more than they've ever admitted. Until it is found, Ruthie's case is not just one family's nightmare. It's a question that lingers for us all. Because if someone can disappear so completely, in plain sight, what does that say about the rest of us?
Ruthie is more than a name on a missing persons list. To her family, she is forever a daughter with a laugh that filled a room, a young woman who dreamed of finishing college, who carried both promise and struggle, but never stopped pushing forward. Her absence is felt in the quiet moments, at birthdays that go uncelebrated, at family gatherings where her chair sits empty, in the spaces where her future should have unfolded. Her story is not isolated. It is woven into a much larger and heartbreaking truth, the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Too many daughters, sisters, and mothers have vanished, and too often their cases fade into silence before justice is ever reached. Ruthie's disappearance is one chapter in that devastating pattern, but remembering her means refusing to let her life be reduced to statistics or cold case files. To keep her memory alive is to keep demanding answers, to keep speaking her name, and to ensure that stories like hers are not buried in the margins. Because behind every missing person is a family that refuses to stop searching, and a community that deserves better. Ruthie was a dreamer, a fighter, and she deserves to be remembered as such. If you want to see more stories like this one, subscribe, because every missing person deserves to be remembered.